you uncovered in the documents from this take?
Yeah, I mean, we were just looking through it, and a lot of it was regarding messages that have been deleted and possibly encrypted, trying to hide possible relationships. And I'm going to let you go into more detail. You were talking about, this is something that could be pretty damaging.
Yeah, I mean, so of course we're looking at this in real time, right? But there are allegations in here in terms of furthering the scheme to defraud about not just text messages and email messages and cell phone voicemails, but WhatsApp messages that are encrypted. There are some references in here to of the officer allegedly figuring out ways to delete certain messages that he allegedly had with public official one, who I think we can fairly assume is the mayor here. And another thing that kind of jumped out at me is after the internal investigation by NOPD, the interim superintendent, according to the indictment, told the mayor the findings of those investigations, and it seems like recommended that Officer Vappie get reassigned. That's what happened. And then several months after that, there's an allegation in here that the mayor met with the interim superintendent, told the interim superintendent that, I believe it was a she, that she was not going to be named the NOPD superintendent, and Officer Vappie attended that meeting. That jumps out at me.
And that was Chief Woodfork, too, to put that into consideration of where things were in the timeline.
Sure, and I'm not an expert in NOPD hierarchy. It seems a little odd to me that Officer Vappie would be at that meeting. That seems, arguably some level of retaliation. Of course, the mayor might have other thoughts as to why that decision was made. But those are a couple of things that jumped out. The encrypted messages, then the after-the-fact kind of Googling how to delete those messages, coupled with this interim superintendent, Superintendent Woodfork, not getting the job, being told by the mayor that she wasn't getting the job, and Officer Vappie being present for that meeting.
And I mean, one of the things, too, that we saw in these documents here, guys, is he even had Googled trying to get more information on where a news reporter was living at the time. That's something that is not usually okay for an officer to do, correct?
Yeah, I mean, again, jumps out as a little bit odd. We know there have been a lot of news reports about this investigation, right? There is an allegation in here of the officer Googling where does a certain member of the news media live. There's also allegations in here of Officer Vappie Googling what happened to the mayor of Nashville and that mayor's protective detail, because apparently, and of course this was unknown to me until just reading this, the mayor of Nashville had a similar situation. So you can see kind of a lot of pieces coming together. It's not just a straight payroll fraud, although those are the charges, but you can see kind of a much larger scheme of what these actors, according to the allegations, were doing, knowing they were being investigated, knowing there was an internal investigation by PIB, and ultimately culminating with today's charges.
To have the mayor be listed, as the public official and then listed in there, do you think that's damning or damaging for a sitting mayor?
So, I mean, yes and no. There's one argument would say that for the government and the grand jury to adequately tell the story, they have to list who Officer Vappie was assigned to, right? In this case, it's public official one. It's kind of an incomplete story if you don't have that. On the flip side, these kind of encrypted text messages, how to delete them, what happened to the mayor of Nashville and the mayor's protective detail kind of suggests a little bit more. I mean, I think the ultimate question everybody's going to want to know after this is, what did the mayor know about what Officer Vappie was submitting when he was submitting his timesheets, and when did she know it, right? If the mayor was aware that Officer Vappie was claiming to be on the clock when the government now alleges he wasn't, that could be a potential problem with the mayor. Alternatively, it's possible the mayor had no idea what Officer Vappie was claiming, right? That's going to be the $64,000 question.
Hey, Cassie.
We have another question from Travers.
Yeah,
Travers, what do you have to ask?
Sure, no, and this is for Matt and Sarah. We appreciate their time. I know Sarah does high-end defense work. Matt does defense work now, but he was one of the people that prosecuted Ray Nagin. It's a simple question. The mayor is not indicted, but she's at least mentioned, possibly implicated in here. If you could ask them, as defense lawyers, what would their advice be to the mayor at this point? We know that Jeffrey Vappie has been charged, but the mayor being mentioned so many times in here, what would their advice be for Sarah and Matt if they were defending the mayor or at least giving the mayor advice at this point?
Yeah, so Travers' question to both of you guys is, Mayor Cantrell's not been, indicted or even implicated necessarily in this. But what would be your advice to the mayor moving forward from this?
Sure. I mean, the mayor has already done the thing that I would first advise her to do, which is to hire counsel. She has a lawyer. She's had a lawyer for some time as this investigation has been going on. And I'm sure that they're going to have, a lot to discuss and follow up on now reading the facts of this indictment. My advice to her also probably would not be to make any public statements concerning what's in this indictment, what the allegations are. I know she may be eager to try to go on TV or make some kind of public statement, proclaiming her innocence or trying to sort of get ahead of this. But as a criminal defense lawyer, very often, we tell folks you want to kind of wait and get a sense of what the full picture is before you start kind of giving your side of the story publicly.
Sure. What about you, Matt?
100% right. Got counsel, that would be the first step. You would almost always caution your client not to make any public statements. Tough when you're talking about a politician, right? There's going to be questions. The mayor is going to be out in public. That's going to be tough for her to do, but that would be something you would certainly counsel your client to do. The other thing you would do is kind of dig into these allegations. They're referencing certain text messages. You'd want to gather all those text messages. Are there other text messages that aren't a part of this indictment? Are there other explanations for why, for example, Officer Woodfork didn't get the job? And again, getting back to what we talked about earlier, is there any contemporaneous evidence that suggests the mayor knew that Officer Vappy was submitting what the government now claims are fraudulent timesheets? And you would want, as the mayor's counsel, to find out, what did she know? Is there any documentary evidence of that? Text messages, emails, anything like that?
I have a quick question, too, for both of you guys. So, recently a PIB investigation was just said that an outside consulting firm is looking into Officer Jeffrey Vappy, among other officers, who supposedly had gone in and looked up a woman's information. One of the women's that the mayor had said was stalking her. That claim was dropped by the judge. But could something like that, an ongoing PIB investigation or an investigation for the NOPD, be added to this as well, mid-jury and all this stuff?
I mean, the government always has the right to file what's called superseding indictments, which means that if they develop new evidence or new information of additional federal crimes they believe have been committed, they can do that. At this point, I think it's very premature to say if the results of that investigation would even be criminal in nature, whether or not that would rise to the level of federal criminal charges. I think it's too soon to say whether that's a possibility.
Cassie, one question I think people are wondering from an expert advice, do you anticipate the mayor resigning, staying in office? What do you anticipate?
Well, I mean, look, the mayor hasn't been charged with anything yet, right? So I think regardless of what people's political views are of the mayor, she's not been criminally charged with anything. Even if she were criminally charged, of course, in our system of justice, you're innocent until proven guilty, right? So I'm not a politician, I'm not a political expert, but of course, if I were her lawyer, my advice to her would be like, you haven't been charged with anything. Certainly there's an investigation swirling around, but that doesn't mean she needs to resign or some action should be taken against her at this point.
Does Vappy, reiterate to our viewers, does Vappy keep, I mean, obviously he has not been convicted. Vappy keeps pension, everything, correct?
As far as I know, I believe that would be the case, and that's something that would have to be handled separately internally in terms of the NOPD. But he's already resigned from his position, so he's not currently actively working for the NOPD or on the security detail, and that would be a separate proceeding that would have to be handled, I think, within the NOPD.
Yeah, and I mean, there's cases and jurisprudence that deal with this. My understanding is when a public official gets criminally charged with something, and let's say they get fired as a result of being convicted of those charges, they may forfeit the ability to get any sort of public pension. By voluntarily resigning, I think that probably gives him a leg to stand on in terms of keeping that pension, but honestly, that's been subject to a lot of court decisions in the last kind of decade, so don't know the answer to that.
And we have another question from Travers, if you don't mind asking that, Travers.
Look, Sarah is a great defense attorney, but Matt ran public corruption with the U.S. Attorney's Office. He prosecuted Ray Nagin. When you read something like this, and you are mentioning public official A, who is clearly Mayor LaToya Cantrell, when prosecutors do that, they're not doing it blindly. There is a reason for that. Can you ask him, is the end game here bigger than Jeffrey Vappy?
Do you think the end game here is bigger than Jeffrey Vappy when it comes to, they listed the official A and then the mayor is being listed within here? Travers said, normally they don't just throw things in there to throw things in there.
Yeah, I mean, in any government investigation, you're going to be looking at all the potential parties, and generally the government's job here, the Department of Justice's job, is to hold people accountable for their wrongdoing. If there is evidence to suggest the mayor knew about this, or maybe even other things, we know there have been other allegations swirling about there, it could mean that this is a small part of what's a larger investigation. It could mean, as Sarah pointed out, a superseding indictment or further charges. I think it's premature at this point. We really don't know. There isn't anything directly on point in this charge that suggests she knew what he was representing about his timesheets. Now, like any criminal case, Officer Vappy has now been charged. He has the opportunity to defend himself in court. He'll have an opportunity to go to trial. He also has the opportunity to plead guilty and potentially cooperate, right? He may have information, maybe not, but he also could have information that might help the government. If that information implicates somebody else, the mayor or anybody else, that's something the Department of Justice is always interested in hearing. So it's possible that could go there. We just don't know at this point.
And I mean, that's been done in the past where someone has been convicted or even during the trial has come forth with new information to try to get a lesser charge?
Yeah, not just done in the past, that's common, right? Again, I'll reference the Nagin case. There was the Greg Mefford indictment involving Greg Mefford, the former chief technology officer, and a city contractor. There were other public officials wrapped in that, and then as a follow-on to that, Mayor Nagin was indicted and ultimately convicted. So that is common in the system.
And take me a little bit back to you being there with Ray Nagin's conviction. I mean, that was a long process in itself.
Yeah. Greg Mefford, the first indictment, I believe, came out in 2011. Ray Nagin wasn't indicted until 2014. And I believe he was convicted either in 2015 or 2016. And I can tell you the Mefford indictment didn't start when he was indicted. It started, actually I take that back because I'm thinking about this. I think the Mefford indictment might have been 2009. So you're really talking about a multi-year process. And in that case, you're talking about multiple public officials and multiple kind of schemes to defraud there. So this could be, that was a 4, 5, 6 year process. This could be similar. It may not be, but that's how long these things generally take.
And that was prior to everything, the gathering information too. So that includes all of that.
Yeah, that's right. So as I'm thinking more about it, I mean, the Mefford indictment, I believe, as I'm thinking about it, was 2009. That investigation started at least a year or two before that, right? So, there's a year or two of gathering records, analyzing those records, interviewing witnesses, determining what potential charges and wrongdoing could be there, right? Then there's the indictment. Then there's the criminal justice system. In that case, one of the defendants chose to go to trial. He went to trial. After that conviction, Mayor Nagin was indicted, and there was a follow-on. So again, multi-year process and starts from not just when the indictment is brought, but months, years before that.
How sensitive is it when you have a case that obviously had someone connected with the mayor as even an employee?
Well, I mean, they're always sensitive. I mean, grand jury investigations by law are supposed to be secret. Prosecutors aren't supposed to be talking about them. Grand jurors are prohibited from talking about them. And then when you're talking about a small community like New Orleans, and then you add on top of that the fact that this is a public corruption type of an investigation, it is really very sensitive. And one of the things from a law enforcement perspective I can tell you is the more time that passes that you are acting in a covert status, right, without other people knowing about it, without news reporters reporting on it and everything else, the more likely you're going to get people to talk to you, right? And so that's some of the things that, helps prosecutors as they are building these sorts of cases. Obviously, this has been subject to news reports going back months or even a year or more, right? So a little bit different posture here, but yeah, they are very secret, and that's just the way it is.
And with this case, do you think that it could be possible that Officer Jeffrey Vappy would flip and cooperate to create a new indictment?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know. as his lawyer, I'm sure his lawyer has talked to him about this process. I mean, one of the things we can deduce is the fact that this is an indictment, right? Generally, in a white-collar case, the U.S. Attorney's Office would approach a potential target with his or her lawyer and would give them the opportunity to plead guilty, not through an indictment, but through what we call a bill of information, right? At this point, given that Officer Vappie has been indicted, that suggests, at least right now, he doesn't believe the charges, he's not interested in cooperating or anything like that. But could it go there? Sure. Lots of defendants plead guilty after they're criminally charged. It's a common occurrence. And of course, if he has information as his lawyer, you would be talking to him about, here's ways to potentially help yourself out. Do you have any information that would help the government potentially go after others?
Is there any time that if you had more information and you tell it, but it could probably hurt you also telling it, would that be able to be in the process too?
So what typically happens in those scenarios is once you've agreed to a plea deal with the government, now we're getting, of course, way ahead of ourselves, right? But if Officer Vappie decided to cooperate, he would almost certainly be required to plead guilty to some of these charges in here. And essentially what happens is you plead guilty and the government grants you immunity for any further wrongdoing you've done, right? As long as you come in and are honest about everything that you've done, they've held you responsible for the charges in this indictment, and then you get immunity for everything else, assuming you tell the full truth. And of course, in the government's eyes, you're hoping that that leads to charges against others.
Travers has a couple more questions, I think.
Yeah, no, Cassie, I appreciate it. I know this is happening in real time out there. We just got the indictment and we're all looking through it right now. But given Matt Chester's background on something like this, I know he can't hear me, so if you can relay something like this. Anytime that a public official like this, like the mayor, public official A or public official 1, when they're mentioned in a criminal indictment like this, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is that for them? And I'm not trying to put the cart before the horse, and Mayor Cantrell has not been charged with any crimes, but just the fact that federal prosecutors felt it worth mentioning her in this federal indictment, on a level of 1 to 10, how bad is that for the person usually?
Yeah, so with your experience, having seen this, in the past, having an official be listed in this indictment here on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad would you say that is? You know Travers and loves his numbers.
I know Travers, yes. So, I mean, again, I think there's an argument that public official 1, who again I think we can deduce as the mayor, there's an argument that had to be included in here because it completes the story of who Officer Vappie was assigned to. But, I mean, if I were the mayor's counsel, I would be concerned about some of these allegations. They're talking about, again, the text messages between the two of them, messages that are encrypted between the two of them, post-investigation deleting those messages between the two of them. That suggests that the government is at least looking at the mayor, concerned about that sort of a conduct, and you want to evaluate as the mayor's counsel whether the mayor's done anything wrong and whether the government might view the mayor as having done anything wrong. So not a great look for the mayor, right? Not something that as the mayor's counsel you would want. But again, there's no kind of silver bullet that clearly indicates that the mayor knew what Vappie was attesting to. So still kind of premature to answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely doesn't paint a great picture here when you're talking about relationships and hiding things.
Yeah, unfortunately, New Orleans has had its fair share of this sort of a thing. So certainly not a great picture when you're talking about public dollars and the allegation of being misused. Now, I will say, this is just an indictment, right? Every defendant's innocent until proven guilty. Indictments are just allegations. So, now Officer Vappie will have the opportunity to defend himself and the government will have the opportunity to convict him, and we'll have to see how it plays out.
Travers, did you have any questions?
Sure, I have. I think we all have a lot, Cassie. When it comes to Officer Jeffrey Vappie, and I know that obviously this is focusing on him today, he is now charged with all of these crimes. When it comes to this, and look, you're looking at the counts right here. Counts 1 through 7, wire fraud, and then count 8, making a false statement. But the wire fraud obviously deals with payroll-related topics and also the hours that he worked. The mayor is the CEO of the city. She runs the police department. Cassie, this is a question for Matt Chester, he's got a great experience level when it comes to these kind of public corruption cases, not just running that division, but also handling the Mayor Ray Nagin case. When it comes to something like this, Does Jeffrey Vappy become a cooperating witness? Because we've seen so many times, and he mentioned people. Greg Meffert in the Nagin case, you've heard Matt Chester mention, became a star witness in the Nagin case. Could you ask Matt Chester this? Could Jeffrey Vappy essentially go from criminal defendant to star witness in any potential future case when it comes to the city, the NOPD, or possibly the mayor?
Yeah, that's right. That's a really great question, Travers. So do you think that in this instance that possibly Jeffrey Vappy could go from being indicted to being possible key witness in a possible indictment in the future?
Sure. I mean, that's what happened with Greg Meffert, right? He was criminally charged. He, at some point in the process, chose to cooperate. Now, he ultimately pled guilty. He was ultimately sentenced to some term of imprisonment. But he was a key witness in the Mayor Nagin case, right? He was one of the government's bigger witnesses to provide direct testimony about what the mayor at that time was doing. So, when you're talking about a sprawling investigation like this, multiple layers, multiple people involved, that's not uncommon. So it's possible it could go there. Don't really know yet for sure, but certainly possible.
And with these two charges that are going on right now, which would you say is the worst of the two when it comes to breaking these laws?
Yeah, so I mean, the two charges, as I read this, are essentially false statements and wire fraud. Wire fraud is by far the more serious charge. It carries a higher term of imprisonment. It involves kind of more serious conduct when you're talking about actually enriching yourself while, according to the government, while lying, while doing so, right? False statements are serious. They are a federal crime. They carry a lower term of imprisonment. It's just essentially the allegation that you lied to a federal agent. So between the two, wire fraud certainly more severe than the false statements charge.
When it comes to wire fraud, real quick, how long of a term could you be serving for something like that?
Yeah, so I figured you might ask me that question. So wire fraud carries a maximum possible penalty of 20 years in jail for each count. Now, sentencing in federal court is a complicated process. At the end of the day, sentencing is left up to a judge. Judges have lots of discretion. They can't go above 20 years with respect to a wire fraud count, but they could go as low as probation. What typically happens if a defendant is convicted, there's a process by which the U.S. sentencing guidelines come into play. That's a formulaic book that essentially spits out what is considered to be a reasonable number, right? And so my guess is, in a case like this, Officer Vappy's first-time offender, it's a nonviolent offense, you're probably looking at some term of imprisonment, but nowhere near 20 years, anywhere potentially 3, 4, 5, somewhere in that neighborhood generally is, depending on the money involved and the conduct involved, that's the sort of thing that you would be looking at for a first-time offender.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for your invaluable information. I know, guys, we have a lot of questions that we still want answered, and we're going to continue to try to ask those questions for you and guys get more information. But for right now, Travers, I'm going to send it back to you, and I'll let you guys know if I have any other update.
Yeah, no, we appreciate it, and we appreciate Matt Chester's insight. He was one of the two lawyers